All right. I am pleased to be joined here by Scott Keeter, the Senior Survey Advisor at the Pew Research Center. Scott, as we approach Election Day here in the U.S., no shortage of questions about polling right now.
Oh, for sure. I can read them out to you. Number one, are the polls still broken? Number two, are the polls still broken? Number three, and on and on.
So you're in my emails then. You're getting my messages. You're getting the same messages. Well,
Yep.
Talk to me about that. There's been a lot of headlines, even in the last couple of days. We've tried to dive into it a bit in terms of the polling errors of the most recent elections, the attempt by pollsters to correct for things. What is the state of play here in terms of trust, in terms of correcting for some of the recent challenges that pollsters have had the past couple cycles?
It's been a really turbulent period for polling. I mean, we've struggled for 20 or 30 years with declining response rates. And surprisingly, even as we were able to reach fewer and fewer people that we were trying to reach, accuracy of polling didn't really suffer. If you look over the broad sweep of things, polling has been extremely accurate and really remains quite accurate for most topics that we poll on. And we know that because we compare polls to government benchmarks that are based on very high response rate, high quality surveys.
So you're talking about the government is doing surveys with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And so You're able to take your polls of 1,000 to 1,200 people and compare them.
Yes. And that, we look at a whole variety of measures, mostly in the non-political area because the government typically doesn't poll on politics. But for all kinds of things, a lifestyle, benefits that people receive, health conditions, all kinds of things, including things that are sort of political, like vaccine uptake. We find that our polling is very accurate. We still have trouble reaching a very high share of the people we try to reach, but by and large, we get very good. We get very good accuracy. But in the last two presidential elections, polling has fallen flat. In 2016, the national polls were pretty good. They were off by only 2 or 3 points. And on that basis, you'd have to say really successful because the margin of sampling error alone is that much or more in most polls.
Right. So you're saying 2 to 3% off, that's success as far as the pollsters are concerned.
That's about as good as you can expect a random sample of 1,000 or 1,500 people out of the public to be. But the problem was in 2016, the state polls, particularly in the upper Midwest, were not very good. And they left the very clear impression that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And when Donald Trump took those Midwestern states and he won the election, then people said, what went wrong with the polls? 2020, we can go back and talk a little bit about what 2016's problems were, but 2020 pollsters thought that they might have fixed most of the problems. In that election, the polling was actually worse. At the national level, the errors were plus 4 percentage points, biased in a Democratic direction. And the state polling was even worse, with the states in the upper Midwest coming in again as mostly inaccurately polled, but a lot of other errors as well. And so, we came out of the two presidential elections saying, wow, there really is a problem. But complicating the story is that in between those elections, in 2018, polling did a pretty good job in the state elections, the Senate and gubernatorial elections, and also overall in forecasting the share of votes at the House of Representatives that the Democrats versus Republicans would get. And the same was true in 2022. And so if you just looked at the off-year elections, you'd say there really wasn't much of a story here. Polling did a good job. They missed some races, but by and large, pretty good. The pattern, of course, is that it appears that when Donald Trump is a candidate, polls have a problem. Yeah. And that's where I think the anxiety about this election lies, isn't it? He's a candidate again, and people are rightfully asking the question, have polls figured out how to poll his constituency accurately?
What do you attribute that to? I remember back in 2016, there was sort of the reluctant Trump vote, right? The idea that some people wouldn't admit to pollsters. And then by 2020, and I remember this being at CBS News, where we do frequent polls, that there was a response issue among his supporters. They don't trust the media, and so if they're getting a call about a poll, they don't trust it. They don't want to partake there. Is that the extent of the issue there?
It may very well be. And if that's the explanation, then unfortunately there's not a lot that pollsters can do about it. It's a problem of not, if you don't know who you're not getting, and if the why is they don't like you and they don't want to take part, or because Donald Trump has told people not to trust news organizations and don't participate in the polls, then you may not have a scientific way of correcting for that. You may have an unscientific way, then you could just add 3 or 4 points.
Right, and are some pollsters doing that? Numbers. I mean, is that something that some have done?
I don't think anyone admits to doing that, and I hope they're not doing it, but that would be if you thought you had a theory of the case that said we're missing 3 or 4% of the public who are Trump supporters but don't want to participate in polls, and that's over and beyond whatever share of the Harris supporters don't want to participate, then you could probably find a justification for adding that number to Trump's number. But that's not a very scientific thing, and nobody knows what that number is. And so we would have a problem. Now, there are other theories for why 2020 might have been off after 2016 was off. 2016 was a case where there was a plausible explanation that a lot of pollsters, particularly organizations polling in the states, did not adequately weight their samples to account for the fact that people with less than a college education are less likely to participate in polls. And if that's true, and they also are disproportionately supporters of Republican candidates now, or Donald Trump in this populist era.
Right, we're seeing increasing this education divide, where if you have a college education, you're more likely to go Democrat.
That's right.
And then below that, you're typically going Republican.
And that pattern had not been true prior to 2016. But I think the post hoc theories are that Donald Trump ran a populist campaign. He kind of crystallized a movement that was already underway. You see it all around the world. This is not a new phenomenon by any means, but it was new to the U.S. Mm-hmm. And if a pollster did not adequately make sure that their sample represented non-college white voters in particular, then they underestimated his level of support. When we fast forward to 2020, most pollsters took that lesson to heart. And if they hadn't been weighting on education, that's the term we would use, is statistically adjusting your sample to make it look more like the population.
Right, that's the term weighting.
Weighting.
Like weight. Okay.
So you take the people that you get and you may count them 1.2 times or 1.4 times to make up for the fact that you didn't get the right number of them. So pollsters did that in 2020, and it still didn't solve the problem, or maybe it solved that problem, but another problem popped up. And that's one of the theories for 2020. 2020, if you think back 4 years, was a very odd year. I mean, it was the pandemic.
Right.
It was the last year of Donald Trump's first term. The whole liberal left side of America was inflamed and really mad about Trump. Nothing. I mean, maybe beyond the norm, maybe not beyond the norm, but the kind of thing that you get in a modern polarized society where the out party's supporters are ready to fight and to throw the guy out. And but then you had the pandemic itself, and it had an impact directly upon how people were going to vote, people that were averse to going to polling places because they felt they'd be exposed to the virus. And so you had this surge of absentee voting. And on top of this, you had a tremendous increase in turnout compared with 2016.
Yeah, we're talking about 20 million more Americans showed up to the polls, which you as a pollster need to calculate for or basically predict in your equation as you're doing polling ahead of time.
That's right. And we did a post-election analysis that we do every year where we take our panel of about 10,000 adults and we match all of them to voter files, the publicly available records of whether people vote or not. So we have a validated record of who voted and who did not. And by our calculations, a quarter, 1/4 of all voters in 2020 had not voted in 2016. That is a gargantuan amount, much larger than normal. And that could create errors in the pre-election polls if, number one, the pre-election polls did not anticipate that new voters would be such a big share, and none of them, as far as I know, did. And second, if it mischaracterized who those new voters were going to support. And that normally we think of new voters as young voters, and young voters over the past couple of decades have been more supportive of Democratic candidates than Republican candidates. So you had this expectation that new voters would be a normal-sized group and that they would be heavily Democratic. And they were not a normal-sized group, and they split about 50-50.
So that brings us to today. Do we have a feeling that 2024 is going to be more like 2016? Do we have a feeling it'll be more like 2020? What's when you put together the calculus here, and you're like, okay, based on we're going to put 1,000 to 1,500 people together. Are we feeling more like it's 4 years ago or 8 years ago?
I wish I knew the answer to that.
You're free to punt. You're free to punt, Scott.
Yeah. What I'll tell you is that pollsters are not going into this election blind. Mm-hmm. They may not have the means or tools to fix the problem, but they certainly have the motivation to do so. And, I think it's, I hope that your listeners realize that the people who are involved in the polling world today, for the major news organizations, the university survey centers that are doing a lot of the highly publicized polls, Pew Research Center and others, we're all professionals and we have our reputations to think about. Our peers are these other organizations. There is no incentive for us to have our thumb on the scale for one candidate or another. I don't know how I would rig the election by affecting Pew's polls to favor one candidate or the other. I don't know, would I boost Harris to dishearten the Trump supporters? Would I boost Trump to make the Harris supporters work even harder?
Right. So, psychologically speaking, if you were like, what, more for one side or more for the other, if you give let's call it your candidate a boost, then they can make that side complacent. Hey, we're in the lead. I don't need to show up on Tuesday.
Yeah. So we're all trying hard. And so the question is, what are we doing? And the answer is, I think that the polling profession has let 1,000 flowers bloom. We did a study a couple of years ago that showed that most pollsters, over 60% of them that had polled in 2016, used methods that were different in their polling in 2022. And that much of the change actually happened after 2020. So people were experimenting with new ways of reaching people. A lot of people are using mail, which is an old survey technology. Hardly a technology.
That's how surveys began like 100 years ago, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so reaching people by mail, maybe pushing them to take the survey on the web, maybe still calling them, maybe texting them instead of calling to get people to answer.
We hear from a lot of people who say they get text messages and they don't know whether it's a scam. They don't know if it's a legitimate polling organization.
Yeah, I mean, that is a concern. I mean, we're all living in this world where everything you do, from buying a sandwich to going to the doctor, you get a poll immediately after you do that. And so there's a sense in which the resource of people's time and willingness to cooperate has been overused. And so and then there's a trust issue. whether or not you like or don't like the sponsors of polls, there's a trust issue of whether the poll's legit and are you giving information to someone who's going to use it against you in some fashion. So it's understandable that people would be reluctant. And so despite that, it's still pretty amazing to me that we get results that are as accurate as they are. But, the problem is we're asking polling to do something in a very competitive, equally divided country that's very difficult. We're asking it to say, not only how does the country divide in this election, but which of these people are actually going to show up to vote? Yes. We're asking polls to, common phrase you hear is to model a population that doesn't exist yet, or it's in the process of becoming a population as we speak, because people are actually voting right now and will be up until Election Day.
So the metaphor that I heard from my old friend, the elections director at CBS, Anthony Salvanto, is soup. That basically you're trying to predict the ingredients in the soup that'll show up on Election Day, and then when you take that sample, you take that poll, you're putting a spoon into the pot of soup, and you got to make sure you mix it up accordingly to get an accurate characterization of what the soup tastes like. Scott, do you have a favorite metaphor when people ask you to explain polling to them?
Well, I don't know. We're near Halloween, so I like the blood metaphor, which is that if you don't believe in random sampling, then the next time you go to your doctor and he or she says, I need a blood sample, you say, well, I don't believe in sampling. Take it all.
Take all the blood to figure out what's going on inside me. Yes.
So we know that sampling works. I mean, it's been used for decades by industries and organizations. And, so the theory on which polling is based is very sound. And pollsters have developed very good sort of rules for how to do unbiased questioning. It's not that everybody always follows those rules, but we know how to ask unbiased questions that get accurate answers.
Yeah, you have to be very careful. The order of the questions, the wording of the questions, right?
If I ask you a bunch of questions about crime and immigration, and then I ask you who you're going to vote for, the chances are that if you're a sort of marginally engaged voter, the fact that I raise these issues that are maybe good for Republicans this year might lead you, if you're on the fence, to say, well, I think I'm going to vote for Trump because the crime and immigration are things that bother me. But if I raised issues of abortion and healthcare access to you and then ask you, same voter, and you're on the fence, you might say, well, I'm going to vote for Harris because I think she's better on those issues.
Because now I've been thinking about them for a couple of minutes based on your questions.
Exactly. I've raised those considerations in your head. So I think that we know how to do it right, but we are in an environment where the public is evenly divided, and it's going to come down not to what the national poll says, but what goes on in a whole series of states, and all of them are equally divided right now. So if it turns out that one candidate wins a bunch of states by 6 points or something, and the polls are still saying it's 50-50, then, I think we'd say, well, we didn't fix it. Yeah. On the other hand, if it turns out that one candidate or the other wins by a little bit because they were able to put together a combination of states when all of them were basically on the knife's edge, then I think that's success by the standards of what polls can accomplish.
Yeah, based on the numbers we're seeing, given how close all these states are within a margin of error, ultimately, regardless of whether Trump or Harris wins, if the election is close, pollsters can declare themselves a success this go around. Yes?
Yeah, I think that's right.
How should people view it? Should they view it like the weather report? You wake up in the morning, you check the weather, there's a chance of rain. Because I think part of the issue you face, Scott, especially going back to 2016, is expectations. Well, I even when you see that there's certain Nate Silvers and other folks in this world that are like, well, there's a 56% chance this could happen or a 65% chance this could happen. That still means that there could be a 40% chance or 35% chance that the alternative could happen. Should we look at it like the weather?
It is very much like the weather. It's a probabilistic thing, and I think that was a misunderstood thing about even about some of the forecasters in 2016. If if there was a 20% chance that Trump would be able to pull off narrow victories in the Midwestern states and come away with an electoral college victory. It didn't sound like much, and there's been a lot of research that suggests that those probabilistic forecasts have a demobilizing effect on people who read them and don't really understand probabilities that well.
Mm-hmm.
Demobilizing in the sense that it might lead you to think that the race is settled. Hillary's up, she's up 80% to 20%. Sounds like a poll number, but it's not. And if they decided in 2016 that they wouldn't vote because they felt confident that she was going to win, then it had the effect of demobilizing her supporters. I mean, it could demobilize the other candidate's supporters, of course, as well, but we just don't know.
So are you not a fan of probabilistic, like for pollsters going in that direction? Do you feel like that it misleads the public?
That is one of the conclusions you'd have to draw from the research that shows what the impact is. But maybe in the long run we can do a better job of educating the public about what probabilities mean. I mean, it's always been something that people struggle with. I have trouble with it myself. I mean, anytime we think about when you go to see your doctor and he says, well, there's a chance that this is, going to turn into something, or it's probably fine. And you say, well, what are the chances? And, we all have our biases come into play when we have to think probabilistically. But the fact is,
and so in that 2016 example, there's a 1 in 5 chance Trump could be president there based on the probability of those stats. 1 in 5, if you're looking to do something, I take a 1 in 5 chance, right? If it's going to be potentially good news for me.
Yeah. Well, and I've seen an interesting metaphor for some people who do this kind of communication of science research, that if you showed people a theater and you put an X in a random sample of, say, 20% of the seats, and you said that the people sitting in those seats have a communicable disease that will make you very sick, and you don't know who's sitting in what seats, will you still go into that theater? It's only 20% chance that you're going to be sitting beside one of them. Most people would say, oh, heck no. Yeah. They sort of get it if you put it in some graphic way like that. But when you say that a candidate has a 20% chance of winning and it's somebody that you really, really don't want, you don't necessarily react the same way.
So you mentioned at the top as we began chatting here that you've seen about 3 decades here of declining response rates. And in particular, I think a lot of us have taken notice about the lack of trust Americans have in all institutions, whether it's the media, let's say most recently the CDC, the FDA, the FBI, the Supreme Court. We're seeing this diminishing trust. But you say, and I think in particular we look at the last decade here, but you're saying you see this going back to the 1990s?
Well, there's a combination of lifestyle changes, just people becoming busier, becoming more mobile perhaps, and kind of decline in trust in government and other organizations, religion, education, and so forth, that sort of combine to make this kind of effect of people being less available and less persuadable to participate. We were getting, when I first started working at Pew 30 years ago doing consulting work, we were getting response rates that were in the 30s on telephone surveys. And there was
one out of 3 people would actually respond to your question.
Would actually respond. And there was a lot of consternation that number wasn't what it used to be. It used to be in the 50s or the 60s. And how could polling still be accurate? And now when we do our studies to recruit people to our panel and to impanel them, we're getting response rates of 10, 12%. And then when we finally get people into our panel, the numbers are down in the single digits. But we did a study this year in which we mailed people an invitation. We followed up. We included incentives in it. We promised them incentives if they took the surveys. We came back to them. We sent them questionnaires in paper that they could fill out. And we got a 31% response rate. So it's still possible to get through to the kind of samples that we were getting through to 30 years ago. But it takes a lot more work and a lot more money now than it used to.
So when people ask, how you're, the most reliable way to do polling these days, is it via cell phone? Is it online? Do you have like basically a community of folks that you reach out to that are representative of the national population? Is it now mail? What's the combination of platforms that you're using to get an accurate sample of Americans?
Yeah, our best approach to people is using what's called address-based sampling, which is a method that relies on the master list of all residential address in the United States that the U.S. Postal Service compiles and then is marketed by private companies. And from that, you can draw a sample that covers almost all households. It doesn't quite get 100% because there are people who live in certain kinds of places that aren't included, but it's close to a universal coverage as you can get. And then we send a letter with sometimes with money in the letter, sometimes with money in the letter showing through the windowed envelope to a sample of these households. And depending on the study, we may be recruiting people directly to a survey that is the beginning and end of it, or it may be a recruitment to a survey from which we will then ask them to join our panel. And we may give them an opportunity to either go online to take that initial survey, or they can call a number and do the survey over the phone with a live interviewer. Or we may send them a paper questionnaire, which they can fill out and send back. And so we're trying to give people lots of ways to cooperate that they're comfortable with. If a person is suspicious about clicking on a web link, totally fine. Let them fill out a paper questionnaire and send it back. We'll build trust. And then they can either take the survey on the phone when they're on our panel, or they can do it online. But I think that the pollsters who are using multiple methods and using these less techie methods are the ones that are having the most success in reaching the reluctant respondents, the less educated, the less engaged respondents. And those are the people that we're missing, and maybe the people who are supporting Donald Trump disproportionately.
I noticed among the many publications you have to your name, you had one about religion's changing role in American politics. Scott, we speak at a time where there's such divisiveness, and I've been talking to our community about this, where it feels like in America, politics has become religion in terms of the way we approach it. You can't question my candidate. Any form of criticism or even observation that my candidate has done something inaccurately, you're basically insulting my religion. What have you learned about the various trend line in America when it comes to religion and this whole idea that politics is almost serving as a form of religion for people these days?
Well, it's been a while since I've been deep in the religion literature, and I defer to my colleagues who study religion full time here. But I find that theory pretty appealing. I mean, not that it's a good thing that politics has become a religion, but that it is appealing as an explanation for why it has become so fundamental to people's identity and so difficult to get people to look outside of their own tribe to think about what the perspective of someone who's not like them, who doesn't subscribe to the same ideology might be thinking. And it does, in a way, maybe contribute to just seeing people as others and not as fellow humans. But I'm theorizing way beyond my capabilities.
As a good political scientist, you don't have the data to back that up. It's just a theory at this point.
I do not. I'm moving into professor mode, which is always dangerous.
So you guys do a lot of work at Pew. You're not just polling in fact, you're not even polling the day-to-day of the election, but you're looking at, a whole variety of aspects of American society. You got recent headlines about how Americans see men and masculinity, surveys on immigration, surveys on cell phones in schools. As you look to take the pulse of America, so to speak, any of the recent data that struck you as particularly interesting, or areas that, as a pollster now in 2024 going to 2025, that you guys are looking to explore that maybe was not as interesting a decade or 2 decades ago?
Let me respond to that by just saying a little bit about our process. The whole notion of Pew Research Center and its uniqueness came from its very founding back in the late 1980s, when the Times Mirror media company created the Times Mirror Center, which was our predecessor. And their notion was to take journalists and social scientists and put them together in a room and make them cooperate, and to come up with good surveys that would look over the horizon of what was going on in the world and say what's coming down the pike, what's going to be interesting, the way good journalists are always thinking, they have a nose for news, and what's the story going to be. And I think that the studies that you just mentioned are very exemplary of that kind of thing. The Men and Masculinity study, which I need to read in detail. I was involved in one of the little internal focus groups that talked about that to help them develop their ideas. But that's an example of a study where a journalistic way of thinking about how men and masculinity have changed in America, has become politically relevant, especially in this presidential campaign, that we would maybe have something interesting to say if we could put together a questionnaire that asked men how they think about themselves, and what is a good role model for a man in American society today. So, part of our idea generation process internally is to have our former journalists and our social scientists get together and talk about what is the state of the world and what's going to be popping up. We're in the midst of these conversations right now. In fact, was in a couple of meetings like that today.
Yeah, I was talking to someone on your team actually about how people are getting their news. As somebody who has worked in traditional media and has spent the last couple of years now doing news on social media for folks on Instagram, and where people are turning, what platforms, but also who they're getting the news from on those platforms.
One of the big struggles, I think, in this field of research is the fact that not only are media diets so fragmented today relative to what they used to be in the days of 3 major television networks, and the news was the news. But now it's not just that different people have different outlets, but each person's outlet is itself algorithmically different from every other person's. And so you couldn't even do a content analysis of what you receive versus what I receive without making some kind of extraordinary technical effort that I don't even know how you would do it. But we're talking about it and how to do it, because it's very hard to know how the news is affecting people if you don't actually know what news people are consuming. And that's harder to know now than it even was 3 or 4 years ago.
Appreciate all of this. One question I have for you: people who want to partake in Pew surveys, can they sign up somewhere, or do they just have to wait to check their mailbox these days?
Alas. I think one of the secrets to good surveys are that you can't let people volunteer for them. As much as we would love for them to do so, we reach out to you based on your being in the random samples that we choose. And we hope that if we do reach out to you, that you will accept our invitation and will participate. We think you'll find it interesting and challenging, and that it'll be a rewarding experience for you. But we're so grateful to the people who devote a lot of their time to taking our surveys. and in do so represent their fellow Americans.
Scott, as a pollster, what will you be looking at in the next week and a half, and what are you going to be looking at the next morning?
Well, I'm like everybody else. I am looking at the polls. I think that there's some advice out there that don't look at the polls every day. They're not really telling us anything right now that is going to determine or signal to you what's going to happen, and I'm trying to believe that myself. But I do keep up with them. Obviously, it's part of my job to be aware of what the polls are saying. And the day after the election, I think we're going to have a very clear idea. I mean, as you know, the races were not all called on election night in 2020, and there's every anticipation that will probably be the case this year. So we'll be looking at the pattern of the states. We'll be looking at whether polling came in looking like, whether the votes came in looking like the pre-election polls, although you get a lot of counting that goes on after election day, especially in some states like California.
Oh, yeah. California will take a few weeks.
It takes quite a long time to know what the final count nationally is. So I think I'll be like everybody else, just kind of watching and waiting to see how things shake out. No secrets there.
And finally here, an insider tip for the rest of us, non-pollsters, non-statisticians, when we see all these polling headlines, what's your piece of advice to all of us to determine whether I should read further into this, or how do you recommend people read into polls as a professional?
Well, there are a lot of polls out there right now, and if you will take the time to look at a poll, especially to click through to the source and not just to take a headline or something. If you put it on your social media and you leave a link in there for people, they can click on it, go to the source. If the poll is transparent about their methodology, if they'll tell you in some detail how they get their sample and how they're taking account of whether they're weighting on which factors, you don't have to assess whether this is good or bad. Just the fact that a poll is transparent, then I think you can say, okay, that's a poll. I'm going to take them seriously. But the second thing you should think about is, all polls are subject to errors. And so in the end, a little bit of averaging of the polls is a good idea. I still will trust certain polls more than others, but in the end, I think that any poll that looks weird may just be weird. It also may be telling us something interesting and important, but you won't know that until you see other polls confirm it, right?
The outlier might be actually onto something that no one else is, or it just might be an outlier and they totally got it wrong.
Right. And you're not going to know that until, so you just, if it is good for your favored candidate, don't get too excited. If it's bad for your favored candidate, don't get too depressed. Just keep an even keel and remember the sun will come up tomorrow.
Great message to end this conversation. The sun will come up tomorrow. Thank you, Scott.
Great talking with you, Mo. Thank you.